I'll be presenting an overview on fire safety, particularly focusing on new build residential, as that's quite a core part of our business and where most of you are from, so that will be my focus. For those of you that may have joined a previous version of this, I did a version back in July last year and then an updated version in December. This is very similar to the December version, just slightly updated with some updates that have come from the government since then, but it is essentially the same as the December one. So I promise I will not feel offended if you want to leave because you've heard it before. So yes, without further ado, fire safety. So just briefly about us as a practice, most of you will know Calford Seedon. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but we're a multi-award winning multidisciplinary consultancy and can trace our roots back for 70 years. So we've kind of stood the test of time and grown and developed over those 70 years. And our vision, which is really important to us, is that we become a trusted provider of high quality professional services to our clients and anyone that we interact with, whether that is contracting or any third parties that we interact with. We want to be seen as trusted and professional and good advisors. Here's a selection of some of the services that we provide at Calford's. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just so you've got an idea of the breadth of services that we can provide, and a selection of some of the core membership and affiliations that we have, all the usual ones that you'd expect to see there. And the final one on this, sorry, the second to last one on this, is the sectors that we work in. So we work in all these sectors, very strong in residential, which is where a lot of people know us, but we do work in all these other sectors as well. And just finally, our offices, for those of you that don't really know much about us, that we have 6 offices across the kind of south half of the country, with our head office being at Orpington in Kent. Okay, now a little bit about me for those of you that don't know me. I've been at Calford Seedon, it'll be 21 years this year. I know it doesn't look like it. I always get told that. But yeah, I started as a graduate building surveyor and have worked my way up through the company to become a chartered building surveyor. And then over the past 5 or so years, particularly focused on compliance, quality and fire safety, and became an associate member of the Institute of Fire Engineers in 2019. As I say, I'm a partner in the business, and I now head up our site inspection services group, which consists of about 30 site inspectors. I'm also keen on helping people develop in their career, and are the co-lead on our APC mentoring program to help graduates through to become chartered surveyors, and I'm also an assessor for the RCS for the APC as well. So, contents of what we've all come to hear today. 3 main areas that I want to look at. The first one is current legislation and guidance, so giving an overview of that. This is really to get us all on a level playing field, really, to remind us of some of the information that's out there and the legislation and guidance that's there. And then going on to some of the changes that are coming in, and then very just finally and briefly, how we feel we should all be approaching new projects and the new approach that we should have that. Slight warning at this moment, for those of you that have children will know what I'm talking about. The first part is a bit of a journey, should we say, until we get to the changes that are coming in. So please bear with me, and you may know some of it already, but it's useful just to put that foundation down. And like when I go on journeys, when we're allowed to go on journeys, hopefully we'll be able to go later this year. I'm sure I'll be hearing echoes of are we there yet from my children. So we will get there, and it's worth it when we get there to get an update on what's coming in. So let's have a look at current legislation and a brief overview of this. So in relation to fire safety legislation, the primary legislation for this is the Building Regulations 2010, and particularly what's classed as Part B, and I will expand on that in a moment. So that's the regulation that the government has set and sets the standard that is required. There are several documents then that are guidance that provide advice and a strong steer on how you can construct buildings to comply with the building regulations. So the most commonly known one is Approved Document B. Now, Approved Document B is not the building regulations, and it's really important to point this out. It is an approved way to comply with the building regulations. You don't have to follow it. You can follow other guidance such as BS 9999, which is for fire safety and design management of use of buildings that are not residential, and then BS 9991, again, which is that mouthful of fire safety in design management and use of residential buildings. There's also fire engineering that can be used, which is a combination of legislation and various other scientific elements and how the building is going to be used that qualified fire engineers can produce to deal with that. And then we have sector-specific documents, obviously not relevant to housing as such, but schools using building bulletins. Custodial facilities have their own details, police stations and hospitals as well, etc. So focusing on the building regulations, and then we will come on to Approved Document Part B as the main guidance that people use. So the current building regulations are the Building Regulations 2010, and they include the 2018 amendment, which particularly looked at fire safety. So just briefly going through what they are, the main parts of the building regulations in relation to fire safety are, again, the most commonly known one is Schedule 1 Part B. A lot of people think of fire safety and they think of Part B. So that's the main document which people will be familiar with. Other parts of the regulations are Regulation 2, which covers interpretation, and particularly the 2018 amendment, where subclause 6 was added, and I'll explain on that a little bit later. And similarly, Regulation 7, that hopefully you will have all heard of as well, in relation to materials and workmanship. And again, the 2018 amendment included some new subclauses, and again we'll cover those in a short while. The final part, which is getting more and more press, particularly since Grenfell, is Regulation 38, and that is the requirement to provide fire safety information. There's a bit of a misconception out there that Regulation 38 is something new post Grenfell. Actually, it's been in the building regulations as a regulation since 2010, so it has been around a while, but post Grenfell it's been given a bit of a boost, and the importance of it has really been emphasised. So breaking those down a little bit, starting off with Part B. So Schedule 1. Schedule 1 sets out the requirements for the different parts of the building regulations, and we're all familiar with the numbers and the parts of the building regulations, and obviously Part B relates to fire safety, and I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with B1 through to B5 and the different headings that are covered under those. So we have B1 looks at the means of warning and escape from a building. B2 looks at the internal lining of the building, obviously in the event of a fire. The internal fire spread on the linings of a building in the event of a fire. B3 looks at the internal fire spread, and that's looking at the structure. So that's how does the wall perform in the event of a fire. So it looks at separation between the building, compartmentalisation and suppression systems, and also one of the key things is prevention of smoke and fire through unseen spaces. So we're talking about cavity barriers, particularly in floors and ceilings. B4, external fire spread. Obviously, given the tragedy in June 2017 of Grenfell, this part of the building regulations was one which has particularly been looked at. And then finally, B5, access and facilities for the fire services. So this is all about the fire services being able to attend in the event of a fire and have suitable facilities to be able to fight the fire and help people evacuate. So I said I wanted to have a look at the amendments that came in 2018, because they are very core to a lot of work which is being constructed at the minute, and a lot of people are still wrestling with this. So Regulation 2, interpretation, a new subclause 6 was added. And subclause 6A has now included in the building regulations a reference to the external wall of a building. And I've paraphrased in here from the actual regulation what the definition of an external wall is. So it's anything located within any space forming part of the wall. So basically the outside wall. It's any decoration or other finish applied to the external but not the internal surface forming the wall, any windows and doors, and any part of a roof that's pitched at an angle of more than 70 degrees, i.e. a mansard roof. So apologies if you can't see me. If we were in person, you'd see me waving my hands around. But essentially, it's the whole wall construction from the external face of the external finished material to the inside of the building, the inside face, but it excludes the finish, it excludes the paint and the wallpaper, etc. So it's the whole wall build up. And it's really important to remember that that's what it talks about, particularly as post-Grenfell, and even still now, there's a lot of talk about cladding. Cladding is only one part of the external wall build-up, so it's really important that we remember what the external wall definition is, and I will come back to that a little bit later on. There was also another subclause, so 2.6b, in relation to the external wall, now defines what a specified attachment is. So these are things which are stuck to the outside of the external wall. So it now includes a balcony, devices to reduce heat gain such as brise soleil, louvers and those types of things, and any solar panels attached to the external wall. So this is the external wall, not the roof, we're talking about at this stage. So that was Regulation 2 and a new interpretation of that. Regulation 7 was then amended to work hand in hand with Regulation 2 subclause 6, and they added 3 new subclauses in. I've put them in a slightly different order to what they appear in the building regulations because I think it's an easier step through process. So Regulation 7 subclause 2 states that the external wall, as we've just defined, must meet European classification A2, S1, D0 or A1. This is essentially what was termed as the combustible ban to the external wall, and I'll come on to explain a bit more about that, and so we can kind of begin to understand what that means in reality. Then subclause 4, that what was just said about the external wall complying with the European classification just quoted, relates to a relevant building. Okay, so now we're defining that regulation relates to a relevant building, and then a relevant building is defined later on, and that includes residential buildings 18 metres and above, which you'll all be familiar with. That seems to be the cut-off line that has been drawn. However, subclause 3 includes some exemptions to the external wall having to comply with that. And here's a list of the exemptions that are included. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just wanted to point out a few points. The first one, A, cavity trays when used between 2 leaves of masonry. So if you've got a brick and block constructed wall that's over 18 metre, external wall that's over in a building over 18 metres, the cavity tray does not need to meet that European classification. However, that does not apply where we have SFS, METSEC, or whatever system you're using as the internal skin. So that's one to be aware of, and the industry is really working through basically fire rated, which are turning out to be stainless steel cavity trays in that, and obviously stainless steel cavity tray is considerably thicker than a plastic cavity tray, and so there's all sorts of detailing that needs to be considered about that, and how they abut each other, whether they're welded, you can't really lap them, so there's a whole lot of issues which are currently being worked through currently on that one. C, so door frames and doors are excluded, and similarly J, window frames and glass are excluded from meeting that European classification. And then D, electrical installations are included, and there's still questions about what does that actually include? Does that include back boxes from flats and corridors? Does it exclude cables? What about clips that are needed for the cables? Is that part of the electrical installation? What about if it's running plastic conduit? Is that allowed? Extract fans? All sorts of questions on what is included and what's excluded from that. And unfortunately, I don't have all the full answers on those. And then that does lead up, if electrical installations are excluded, what about radiator pipes in walls? Does that mean that we can't now run plastic radiator pipes in those walls? Food for thought. So carrying on with regulation 7, we're now looking at the detail of the implications of residential buildings, multi-occupied residential buildings over 18 metres. The external wall construction must meet the European classification A2, S1, D0 or A1. So what does that mean to us? How do we understand that? Well, my greyed out diagrams slightly give it away there. There are 2 parts to the European classification. There is, first of all, is the class, A1 being the top. And that basically means the material does not combust at all, doesn't do anything, it's completely inert in the event of a fire. And the further you go down the line, as it were, to A2, there's a bit of a reaction to fire, there's a more of a reaction at B and D and so on down the line. The second part then is the characteristics of that product when it is under test. And there are 2 parts of that, and that is how does it perform in terms of releasing smoke, and how does it perform in producing droplets. And each one of these, pardon me, each one of these then has 3 ratings, and I've included them there. So looking at the best performance, S1, in the event there is weak or no smoke given off from a product, that's set on fire in test. And worst case, it's a 3, it's given off a high level of smoke. And clearly the European classifications define what that is, how you measure that. Similarly for droplets, D0 means that there's no dripping in the event of a fire, up to D2 where there's a high dripping amount recorded. And again, that's all defined in the European classification standard. So how do we relate that to kind of, if you like, old money, what the old UK classes were? This is a rough comparison, so it's not an exact comparison, but it's a useful rough comparison. That Euro class A1, you can see in the middle there, is kind of equivalent to the old Euro class of non-combustible. Not exactly, but it's a useful comparison. But you know, use it with a guardedly. A2 is similar to limited combustibility and so on and so forth. So just to give you an idea of those of you that are more familiar with kind of the old the old UK class. And then final part of the building regulations I just wanted to touch on at this stage, obviously just finishing off on what the regulations are, the legislation is Regulation 38, Fire Safety Information. So a brief summary of this, what the regulation says. A person carrying out the building work to a relevant building shall give fire safety information by completion of the work or before occupation, whichever is earlier, to the responsible person. The blue bits are obviously the key bits, so responsible person and a relevant building relate to the fire safety order and what they're defined as that, and the responsible person essentially being somebody of the owner of the building, so the employer in terms of a building contract. But it's key here that it is given before occupation or completion of the works, whichever is earlier. So we would very, very strongly advise clients that you should not be taking completion of a property if you do not have a complete fire safety information pack. It's always been required to be provided. As an industry, we've not been particularly good, particularly pre-Grenfell, at ensuring that that is in place, and that is everybody across the industry, including building control. and we need to make sure that we get back to complying with the regulation. So that is really, really important. So what is the fire safety information though? What is that pack of information? It relates to the design, construction of the building, its services, fittings and equipment that are installed and relate to the operation and maintenance of the building to ensure that it is done with reasonable safety. So it covers everything in relation to fire safety, to use of a building. So knowing what products are being installed, knowing what the approved fire strategy was, what the partitions are constructed of, the materials that are there, and so on and so forth. It covers basically everything in relation to fire safety. So hopefully that was a useful foundation for what the regulations are. What I want to go on to have a look at now is, obviously because some of those have been changed post Grenfell, is actually look to see what did the government do post the tragedy of Grenfell. So we'll move on to that. So following the tragic events on the 14th of June 2017, when 92 people lost their lives in the fire at Grenfell, the government set about a course of looking at what they need, how they needed to respond. One of their particular focuses was, as I've referred to, was the external fire spread on the building, and that particularly relates to B4 of the building regulations. And I'm not going to go through these in detail, and hopefully most of you will be aware of these points, but this is some of the action that the government took. So in June, so in the same month, within a few days, the government set up an independent expert panel, and that panel's remit was particularly to drive through reviewing a whole lot of things about why has this happened, what needs to happen in the future to improve, and so on and so forth. Following that, a month later, the Building Safety Programme initiative was announced, and then in September the government started removing ACM from buildings and testing it, and the Hackett was commissioned as well during this period as part of the Building Safety Programme, with the review from her in June 2018. We then had some updates in terms and development of the Building a Safer Future, an implementation plan, and then proposals to reform the Building Safety Regulator, which came out in June 2019. A lot of this is obviously still ongoing and still being developed. The expert panel also issued a number of advice notes to building owners, so to existing buildings, not new buildings, but buildings that were constructed and obviously occupied. And here's a selection of them, including looking at cladding. There was one in relation to ACM, and then non-ACM cladding that was at risk, spandrel panels, high pressure laminates, balconies, just to name a few. So there were 22 in total that were issued. And then in January last year, they issued a document called the Advice to Building Owners of Multi-Storey, Multi-Occupied Residential Buildings. And the reason for issuing that was the expert panel was trying to consolidate all of the advice notes into one document to supersede all of that. So there was one document which building owners could go to. They did a number of other things. They reconfirmed the fire risk of ACM and high pressure laminates, and they also said that building owners should look at the risk of fire spread. Apologies if someone's just unmuted themselves or joined. If you could make sure you're muted, thank you. So they also said that the risk of external fire spread should be considered for all buildings, not just those over 18 metres, which is, you know, I would agree that completely, because if you've doesn't matter how tall the building is, if you've got the building which is combustible on it, in the event of a fire, it is going to catch fire or obviously respond differently at different heights of buildings, but you just need to consider the risk for all buildings. They also then seem to be setting a very high bar, which people thought might be a precursor to legislation, which was that building owners should obtain evidence that the entire external wall system is designed and installed appropriately. that is incredibly difficult for existing buildings, for building owners to know whether their whole of their, their entire external wall is designed and installed correctly, particularly in older buildings, because records of what was constructed are not particularly great. The fire safety information pack required under 38 has not been particularly great and not always been required. So this is where building owners started to do opening up and investigations. There was also strong advice in relation to assessment of fire doors, and again to determine that the fire doors were installed correctly, and if you was in any doubt that they should be replaced, is paraphrasing what they said. So they really did set the bar quite high, but I must point out that this was advice. This wasn't legislation. It wasn't statutory requirement. It was advice. But it is one of those things, when you get advice from a panel like this, you've got to have a good reason not to be following the advice. Then we had in November last year, there was a one-page supplementary note issued to try to provide a bit of clarification on the guidance note, because there was still quite a bit of confusion from some people, and some of it is actually still quite difficult to understand what the advice is. So the advice note was stated that it is not, the supplementary note stated that the advice note is not government regulation, as I just mentioned, or statutory guidance, nor does it replace or supersede any such guidance. So it doesn't take away from building regulations or approved document or any of the British standards, 9991, etc., or anything else that's been used. And it doesn't have any effect on applying to current legislation retrospectively. So it's not trying to impose current legislation on old buildings. And also they said, critically I think, that it should not be considered as a guide for valuation insurance purposes. And this is all linked into the EWS1 forms and the launch of them, and the development and considerable confusion over them about whether this related to this or not. And then my second point is that there's concern in some quarters that that was reducing the burden on the building owner. It muddied the waters or softened the advice. And I've read some commentators that saying that they felt that it reduced the burden on building owners with the possibility of no remediation to some defective buildings on the basis of kind of quote unquote, it's not quite dangerous enough and therefore we don't need to do anything. And so it has caused some commentators to question whether this was helpful. That there's a lot of mixed opinion about it. Okay, so that's a brief overview of the government's response. What I want to look at now is, and my clicker's stopped working, is looking at approved document B. I said we'd come back to this before we then move on to changes that are coming. So just briefly, I'll just take a sip of my water and then I'll give you a brief recap. We've looked at the current legislation, so what you must comply with under the Building Regulations 2010 as amended 2018, and the various parts of that apply, particularly looking at the changes in 2018 with external walls. We've looked at how the government responded post Grenfell, and now I want to look at approved document part B. Remember, it's not legislation; it's a method of being deemed to comply with the building regulations in relation to fire safety. So if you follow this, you're deemed to have complied with building regulations in relation to fire safety. It's divided, for those of you that are not familiar with it, it's divided it up into the 5 sections that are taken from Schedule 1, Part B of the building regulations, so B1 through to B5, which I briefly mentioned earlier. And then what I'm not going to go into those in great detail, so don't worry, because we haven't got enough time in the day for me to go into those in great detail. Just a few bits I wanted to inform you of, which hopefully you're aware of. So post Grenfell in September 2019, so over 2 years after the Grenfell fire, we finally got an amended version of Approved Document B. So that is version Approved Document B 2019. They did some useful things with that. They made Volume 1 related to dwellings. Previously, Volume 1 was titled Dwelling Houses, and Volume 2 was titled Buildings Other Than Dwelling Houses. So there was always this confusion about where did flats and masonettes fit in, were they in Volume 1 or Volume 2? Well, very sensibly, they've now brought dwellings all under Volume 1, which makes a huge sense. And buildings other than dwellings are now in Volume 2. They removed the old UK classifications, and we now have the Euro classifications included in them, which I mentioned earlier in relation to external wall construction. There was a number of elements that were consolidated, such as sprinkler design, escape staircase guidance, fire dampers and ventilation. And very importantly, as far as I'm concerned, I'm sure you're getting the measure of me now, that Regulation 38 was moved out of an appendix into its own section in its own right. And arguably that contributed to people not properly complying with Regulation 38 previously, that it was an appendix rather than this is a part of the building regulations that you must comply with. There was also some clarifications around walls and ceilings. Despite it taking almost 2 years post Grenfell to be issued, within about a month, I think it was they issued a 5-page correction document where they were still referring to out-of-date British standards and other things like that, but it has all now been updated, which is good. And then it was amended further last year. So the amendment came out in May 2020, and it does now apply. The new amendments came into force and must be followed following the 26th of November. I won't read it there, but basically, if works had not started by the 29th of Jan, then this new amendment applies. So what was the main focus of the new amendment from last year? It was particularly in relation to flats. If we put this into context of what I said earlier, so we're talking about last year, 2020. Remember, in January 2020 was when the expert panel issued that advice consolidating all of the 22 advice notes. And as I mentioned when we spoke about that earlier, that people thought that was a bit of a forerunner to legislation. And in January and February time, there was hints from the government that this 18 metres that we spoke about earlier in terms of external wall construction, that was actually going to be lowered down to 11 metres. So people were anticipating that this new amendment might somehow wrap that up. Unfortunately, when the building regulation was amended, it didn't. There was no further building regulation amendment to include that, and obviously the approved document there didn't amend to reflect that either. But what it did do is it did look at, for blocks of flats particularly, it did bring down in terms of the height of the building, the requirement for sprinklers, reduced from buildings 30 metres or over down to 11 metres or over. So that's a significant change for requirement of sprinklers in blocks of flats. There was also a requirement for huge improvements on wayfinder signage, particularly for the fire services. This includes new recommendations for floor identification and flat identification signage, again for blocks of flats that are 11 metres and over. I've heard a number of people report that some of the reasons behind this was a direct result of something during the Grenfell fire, which has been reported that one of the 999 calls was a man trying to get out of the fire and take his family out. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but when they asked him what floor he was on, he said, "I'm on floor 21." And then a few minutes later, he said, "No, actually, I'm on floor 19." And they said, well, which floor are you on? and it transpired that there was different signage from a previous refurbishment still in place, which caused obviously confusion, and 2 floors different is quite a significant point, because the fire service often will work a number of floors above and below that, so straight away you're increasing that. So this was one of the drivers for improved wayfinder signage within new buildings. There was also some clarifications and corrections, as I mentioned earlier, to errors on the previous version, and table 4B regarding minimum fire resistance was basically updated to reflect the changes in relation to the height reduction to 11 metres for sprinklers, wayfinder signage, etc. That's a very brief overview of approved document part B. We are nearly there yet, as I said, and so what I'd like to do is move on to look at the changes that are coming in. So, excuse me, we'll start off with the fire safety bill, and hopefully everyone is aware of this, but I've just included a brief summary here of what the fire safety bill is. It is a bill that will amend the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order from 2005, and it's making some changes to that order. It's now going to improve the definition to include buildings that contain 2 or more sets of domestic premises. And it's also, one of the key things, it's going to include the requirement that external walls, and remember we've defined what an external wall is in the building regulations, in interpretation 2, subclause 6, the requirements for external walls form part of risk assessments. So risk assessors will have to, the fire risk assessors will have to look at the external wall as part of their risk assessments. And then the fire risk assessor stroke fire engineer will need to determine whether the external wall is safe for lawful use of the building. That's what it says. So presumably that means, does the external wall comply? Is there suitable evidence to demonstrate that the external wall has been designed and constructed to comply with the current legislation for external wall construction at the time of construction? And how does it fare against the current legislation as well, presumably? Flat entrance doors have also must also now be incorporated into the fire risk assessments. There's always been the issue in blocks of flats where you have tenanted properties and leaseholders under leases, who owns the flat entrance door, who's responsible for it, and so on and so forth. This is seeking to bring that into the fire risk assessment to give it more clout, to make sure that those doors are properly assessed, whatever the lease arrangement is, and that they are maintained to the appropriate standard to provide the appropriate fire resistance. So when is this coming in? The enactment is, or was likely to be spring, which I believe we're kind of just, or it doesn't look like it outside, but I believe we're kind of meant to be in spring now. So we are expecting it soon. So far, it's, as legislation does and bills do, it's gone to the House of Lords. The House of Lords have given some amendments, sent it back to House of Commons. They've recently looked at it, taken on board some of it, and sent it back to the House of Lords. As of, I think, about 2 weeks ago, it went back to the House of Lords for a further review. Part of the review that is being looked at the minute relates to, and is all being wrapped up with, what's you're all seeing in the press at the minute about leaseholders, whether they should be responsible and pay for replacement of dangerous cladding and parts of their external wall construction. And the House of Lords, in their original amendments, was trying to protect leaseholders in some of their amendments when they first sent it back to the House of Commons. So there's been a reasonably positive response from the House of Commons in regard to that, and obviously we've had some further publication recently of, I think it's what, £3.6 billion been set aside to help remediate dangerous external walls, and so it's been slightly delayed as this kind of other process and approvals and funding and stuff is also being dealt with as well. But it is coming in, and it's something really important for you as building owners are aware of, particularly for your fire risk assessments. So the bigger and more heavyweight piece of legislation, which is in draft currently, is the Building Safety Bill. This is a very significant, or it's going to be a very significant change to buildings, our construction process and construction products regulation. It's what's called an enabling piece of legislation, so it sets the rules, and there will be secondary legislation on the how we actually comply with this Building Safety Bill, and that will follow on. And that secondary legislation should be coming out throughout this year and next year. Some of the points I'm going to cover from this point on relate to buildings and the construction process. I'm not going to attempt to start to explain any of the construction product regulation changes, how that's linked to Europe and us now leaving Europe and different families of products. I did go to a seminar on this, and it's very confusing, very, very detailed, and there still is not a lot of answers on it. So there is some good news regarding construction products, which I will touch on right towards the end of this presentation. But let's have a look at the Building Safety Bill. There are 5 parts to the bill, 119 sections, including 8 schedules. What I particularly want to look at are parts that relate to, 3 parts. Part 2 that relates to the new Building Safety Regulator, BSR, which is a new defined term from one of the main recommendations of the Hackett Review, in terms of having a body in place to look at buildings, and particularly high risk buildings. And you may remember that Hackett's recommendation was that building control, HSE and fire authorities became as a joint organisation to do that. The government's review and ultimate response to that has come up with the Building Safety Regulator. And this regulator is particularly for high risk buildings, and we'll talk a bit more about high risk buildings in a moment. Pardon me. Part 3 looks at the new regulatory regime for high risk buildings during design and construction stage. And then part 4 looks at occupation of high risk buildings. So it's very focused around these high risk buildings, and particularly the duty of accountable persons. The Building Safety Bill also brings in a new homes ombudsman to deal with complaints. And the intention is, and I was trying to find it before I came on any of the latest updates, and I can't find anything to give any more timescale on it. The intention was that possibly by winter this year it would be enacted, and then there would be a transition period through to 2020 where we all need to move across to it. It's also toughened existing powers and brought about the means for using criminal offences for some of the breaches. So it's given more teeth to enforcement for breaches. One new thing that has been announced just a few weeks ago, on the 10th of February, was the government has announced a new gateway development levy. We don't know the full details of that. They've said that it is going to be a focused levy to ensure that appropriate money is obtained, shall we say, by the government to use in relation to building safety, and particularly high risk buildings. We don't know much more about it other than that, but consultation should be being issued shortly with regards to how that levy, what that levy is, how it's going to apply, and all that type of good things. So looking at the Building Safety Regulator, a key part of the Building Safety Bill. The Building Safety Regulator is going to be run by the Health and Safety Executive, so not the 3 organisations that Hackett had recommended. It's going to be focused through the Health and Safety Executive. Dame Judith Hackett has been appointed as the chair board to oversee the setup of the Building Safety Regulator, the transition to it, pardon me, and then actually run the new regulator. Not really a great surprise, to be honest. She previously ran the Health and Safety Executive, so there's a lot of synergy there. And obviously, with the Hackett report and her focus in this area, she seems like the right person for the job. So the Building Safety Regulator will be responsible for all the major regulatory decisions from design, construction through to occupation and any works that then take place to buildings. The Building Safety Regulator basically takes the responsibility for high risk buildings away from building control and improved inspectors, and so that is the body which you have to go to. So for most people on this webinar in relation to multi-occupied residential buildings, any of your buildings that are over 18, which have been constructed that are over 18 metres, will need to go to the Building Safety Regulator and follow their requirements. The Building Safety Regulator also has a requirement to look at a competency framework. Something very dear to my heart is the competency of issues. I'm sure we've all experienced some things on site, and you know this was done by a specialist, and you think if that's what they do, they really should be doing better at it, and you have to question sometimes the competency of some things that are built. And so this new competency framework, we don't know how it's going to come out, but I'll briefly touch on it a bit later, but they are charged with looking at that. So continuing to look at what the Building Safety Regulator is there to do, looking at the design to occupation process for high risk buildings. So we're including that multi-occupied residential buildings over 18 metres. There's a number of key duty holders. There are five, possibly six duty holders in total, but some of the key ones are the principal designer, the principal contractor, and then the building safety manager. Terms, the first two terms you will have heard of before because they align with terms under CDM regulation, but the roles will be different. We're still waiting to see how they are fully defined. No real surprise that Dame Judith Hackett chose those terms, though, to be honest, but we just need to know the detail of what they actually are, what they're actually doing, their risk and liability, and how that affects PI, etc. So what's the process? How does it differ for normal buildings? Well, there are gateways that each project needs to go through, and looking at gateway 1, there's a requirement for pre-planning that you submit a fire statement to the Fire and Rescue Authority. Again, all of this, we need the secondary legislation to expand on this and exactly what that means. It does state, as I've said there, submit a fire statement. It doesn't say obtain approval, etc. We don't know whether that actually will be the case, that you need to get approved before you even go to planning, but you must submit your fire statement, and we don't really know how detailed a fire statement needs to be currently. So once you've submitted your statement, you can then go to planning, and then you can move on to gateway 2. So before construction, you must show to the Building Safety Regulator that the building is designed to be safe. So this is basically going to mean that design is going to have to be developed considerably further than it tends to be currently to demonstrate and get approval from the Building Safety Regulator to commence construction. One of the things that this throws up then is, well, what happens when we want to make amendments to the building and changes to the building? Does it mean the whole construction project has to stop until those elements are appropriately designed and approved by the Building Safety Regulator? How is that going to be worked through? We don't fully know at the minute. I wouldn't anticipate that building works will have to completely stop, but there's going to have to be clear, robust systems in place from the Building Safety Regulator as to how that process will need to be managed. So good news is you've got your construction, you've got your design approved, you're constructing, you've made your changes, it's all approved, you've got through towards the end of the project. You've finished the building project, and now you want to complete it and begin occupation, and this is when you have to pass through gateway number 3. So before occupation, you must have the building safety information. this term you'll be familiar with, because I mentioned it several times, relates back to Regulation 38. It may be defined even more through the Building Safety Bill and the secondary legislation as to what that means in relation to high risk buildings. There may be a higher burden, there may be a set standard and way in which that has to be produced. Also at this stage, there's a requirement for a signed joint declaration from 3 of the duty holders: the client, the principal designer and the principal contractor. And that is a signed joint declaration that the building has been designed and constructed to comply with the appropriate standards. Again, we wait for the full wording of it, but that's essentially what it is. And then the building safety regulator will issue you a building registration certificate to say that you've basically complied, and it will be a legal obligation that is displayed in the common parts of the building. Bearing in mind what I said earlier about the teeth that are now being given to the building safety regulator, it's considered that as it's a legal requirement to occupy, if it is not displayed, the ultimate, after I'm sure warnings, could be a criminal offence if it is not displayed. So when the building is then occupied, what happens then with the building safety regulator? As I said, they provide an occupation certificate, has to be displayed. The occupation certificate needs to be renewed every 5 years, and this is where the building safety case comes in. And just a plug for a seminar that 3 of my colleagues did a few weeks back in regarding to the building safety case. That was, if you didn't join that webinar, it's a fantastic webinar. I'd recommend you go onto YouTube, and if you search for Calford Seeding, you'll see all of our previous webinars and other videos about us, and you'll be able to look at it on there. Definitely worth looking, because it covers this more broadly than I'm focusing in on. So back to where we were. Plug over occupation. So the occupation certificate will need to be renewed every 5 years. So you need to make a case to get that approved. So there's information that you need to do and to have to submit to the building safety regulator to ensure that you maintain that occupation certificate. There's a requirement for the client to appoint an accountable person and a building safety manager. Just a pause on the building safety manager. There's a lot of questions about the building safety manager. Who can do it? What ultimately is their responsibility? Particularly, what is their liability? There's been some statements that they will only be able to manage up to 6 properties. Ultimately, they're completely responsible for any fire safety within that building, and any works that are undertaken, fire risk assessments, all that type of thing. They're responsible for that and make sure all of that evidence and information is kept up to date. It is a huge responsibility. There is no real comparison to that in our industry at the minute, and there's a question as to who can do it, and given all those, what is their salary going to be? Could be considerably high because of the potential risk and liability that they are taking on. We'll wait to see. We need a further definition to be provided to understand that more. So during occupation, linked to the building safety manager, all works to be undertaken will have to be risk assessed. And again, we need to understand more what that means and the implications of whether there is a requirement to notify and gain approval from the building safety regulator or not. But it needs to be risk assessed and all information needs to be retained. There's also a requirement that residents are to be consulted much more openly than they currently do, and this includes providing all information that is available. You will not be able to hold back information because whilst you're trying to use it to do the right thing, you're concerned that that's going to set alarm amongst the residents. That is trying to be removed, so there's got to be a complete, open, transparent process, including fire risk assessments and contractual relationships with various parties. Okay, I'll just move on to the final bit on the building safety bill, just to look at some of the other functions that the building safety regulator has got to include. So I mentioned earlier that the Building Safety Regulator is going to oversee a new competency framework. There is a lot of head scratching about this at the minute to understand what that means and how that's all going to be enforced. And clearly the competency of anyone on our building sites is of paramount importance. And it's not just the people doing works, it's those managing them, overseeing them, checking, signing off, etc. as well. So it's very broad. And obviously it goes into designers as well, goes right through. It is anticipated that the Building Act may well be amended to impose competency requirements through the building regulations again, so making it a regulation, so giving it more teeth, that will need to be demonstrated. There's a document called BS Flex 8670. We're currently on version 2 that was issued February this year, and this is trying to define what the competency framework is going to cover and define the competency requirements for some of the key players in the building safety regulator, and those as the principal designer, principal contractor, client, etc. So trying to define all of those. So it's looking at the key duty holder roles. So we are still waiting for all of this information to come out. We don't fully know, as I mentioned earlier. My final point here really is the golden thread, which Dame Judy Hackett coined in the Hackett report, and it's the importance of everything being linked together, this thread running through everything from the initial concept and idea to this requirement to submit to the fire authority your fire statement, through to then how that design is developed. How does that run through the design process to the contractors, to the subcontractors, to the selection of materials, to the supply chain, evidence that things are installed correctly, the appropriate certification and sign off. It covers everything, and there is this requirement that building operators are to maintain a digital record. Again, we've covered this in other seminars, and under BIM seminars as well. We've covered this. I just would encourage you to have a look at some of our other webinars and also some of our advice and talks that we've issued as well via social media and from our website as well. So a number of people asked the government, excellent, what does a digital record mean? And the government's response upset quite a lot of people, because a lot of commentators think that they're setting the bar way too low. Their response was it needs to be BIM level 1, which is quite a low level. That's like the entry level. And the government were challenged on it, but I don't believe they responded, because central government projects since 2016, so we're talking pre-Grenfell, it has been a requirement that all central government projects have a digital record to BIM level 2. So for them to now say in 2020, last year they said this, BIM level 1 is going to be the minimum requirement. There's a lot of head scratching about that. So all I can say on that is there is more to come. We don't know whether there's going to be any further building regulation changes, again from the 18 metres down to 11 metres. Building a safer future. There's more, what is coming afoot from that. Again, I'd refer you to a 3-part look, a look at that we have on our website, and we've issued in our news, and the building safety case as well. The key thing here is not to wait. One of the things that the government has said with issuing the draft building safety bill is we're telling you what our intention is. We're telling you about the building safety regulator. We're telling you about all these things that you need to be bringing in, such as designing buildings more thoroughly earlier, looking at competency, looking at records, getting a digital record in place. So the encouragement is to really start to look at that and start to move across to that and migrate across to that now, so it's not so much of a shock when it does fully come in. The final change I just wanted to pick up on before I kind of look at our recommended approach is something that was only announced earlier this year, which is a new national regulator for construction materials, and hopefully many of you will have seen this in the construction and property press. So the MHCLG announced on the 19th of Jan this new national regulator. I don't think they've given them an exact name at the minute, because I keep referring to them with slightly different titles. But the intention was, and I've got some quotes here from what they published, it's established to ensure homes are built from safe materials. It also has the power to remove any product from the market that presents a significant safety risk, and also to prosecute any companies that flout the rules on product safety. Obviously, this is a direct result of some of the things that are coming out through the Grenfell inquiry, some of the incredibly shocking comments and information that are coming to light. And it's about time, really, that this regulator was formed to help improve that and improve our industry, and give purchase of products and materials confidence that it has gone through the due process and certification, and the certificate that you've got with it is actually what it says it is. This regulator is going to operate out of the Office of Product Safety and Standards, and the intention is that it will work alongside the Building Safety Regulator and Trading Standards. So again, there's this kind of multi-agency approach to a number of these things to really raise the bar within our industry. And the government is currently setting up a panel of experts to provide some recommendations for the regulator later this year. So because it's only recently been announced, we haven't got any more information in terms of dates on that coming out, but it's definitely welcome news. So finally, we are there, and now we're thinking about new projects and the new approach we need to take. So some of my recommendations really to take away for all multi-occupied residential buildings. So this doesn't relate to just buildings above 18 metres. Strongly recommend all of these points, really, that there's adequate programme and timing. It's an obligation under CDM regulation that the client ensures that there is appropriate timing for design, but particularly reflecting back on what the building safety regulator is looking at in the gateways, and thinking and making sure that buildings are designed and design is developed much earlier than we start to build. Develop design early, as I've just said. So particularly, just to think on here, is selection of fire related products. Still too often today, we form builders work holes, we put services in, we do all sorts of things, and then when we get a fire stopping contractor in and we'll say, right, just go around and fill up all the holes, that's not good enough. There's details that they have to follow that need to be known during the earlier design stages to make sure the builders work holes are designed correctly. This is just one example, and how the builders work hole construction interacts with the fire stopping products. You can use the fire bat or whatever it is, and the collars, etc., and then the services that are run through there. How do they need to be located in that? How many have you got? A lot of detailed thought needs to be going. That's just on one issue related to fire products. Would strongly recommend early that the design team looks at a fire construction document register. So what are all the elements that relate to fire construction in the building? Let's pull them all together, starting with kind of strategic level for the fire strategy, driving down to the detailed design. What are the drawings and packs of information you need at that stage, through to what's all the certification and approvals for use of those products, right through to the records for demonstrating, including competent installers. We'd recommend auditing of work packages is done to the right measure to make sure that you've got the interaction right between packages, work packages. Reviewing of trade and quality plans, again making those given the right attention so that they can be used out on site and they're not just good pieces of paper in the office, but so the people installing the products can understand them. Robust digital records that I've mentioned earlier. There's all sorts of ways to do that now. Fire construction benchmarking. We're not talking about benchmarking finished units, we're talking about the various elements that are required to build the building, that you benchmark those as early as possible and you set them as a standard and you leave them open and visible for everyone that's going to install those to come and look at those and sign off that they understand them before they go and install them. This is all part of ensuring the competency and understanding of the installers. Regulation 38 PAC. My view is that that should be a live document, a bit like the health and safety file is required to be now. Why, and this overlaps with a lot of what I've said, why should it not be a live pack now? It should be checked regularly, and all parties should be checking that, regularly, the client, the employer's agents, the contractors, etc. And finally, use of independent inspectors to check that the principal contractor is doing things correctly. To those of you that are our RP local authority clients on the call, particularly for design and build contracts, you're paying the contractor to design and build a compliant building. They have the requirement and the obligation to do that, and they must demonstrate to you that they've done that. In terms of independent inspectors, you want independent people, we recommend you have independent people in to check that they are doing that and to spot check that and to raise any issues. I would recommend that you don't want to take the responsibility away from the principal contractor by getting somebody yourself independent in to sign it off. You want that to sit with the principal contractor because that is what you are paying them for. It's kind of another level of comfort and reporting from somebody independent. That is it for me. Thank you for bearing with me. I hope the journey has been enjoyable. You've learned some new things, and I'll put my final slide up, so thank you for listening.